At 11:42 in the morning on May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith twisted open the armored hatch of the B-17's ball turret and climbed up into a bomber that was already burning. He was 31 years old by the standards of bomber crews where most men were barely 20. It was his first combat mission, and almost everyone in the squadron believed he would never survive it. Not because the mission was dangerous. Every mission over occupied Europe was dangerous. But because Maynard Smith was widely considered the worst airman in the entire 306th Bomb Group. By the spring of 1943, the 8th Air Force was learning the brutal mathematics of daylight bombing over Germany and occupied France. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed to defend itself with heavy machine gun fire and tight formations. In theory, the bombers could protect one another. In reality, the sky over Europe had become a slaughterhouse. German fighter pilots were experienced, aggressive, and deadly accurate. Anti-aircraft guns blanketed every major target. Statistics told the story. An American bomber crew had roughly a 50% chance of surviving the required 25-mission tour. Some groups lost that many aircraft in a single month. One particular target along the French coast had already earned a grim nickname among American airmen: the massive submarine pens at St. Nazaire. Crews called it Flak City. On the morning of May 1st, 78 B-17 bombers lifted off from airfields across England and assembled into massive combat formations. Their target was the German submarine base along the French Atlantic coast. Heavy bombers droned south across the English Channel, climbing to altitude while gunners checked their weapons and navigators studied maps. By the end of the day, the statistics would be brutal. Only 29 bombers would actually drop their bombs on target. 7 aircraft would never return to England, and 75 young Americans would be listed as killed or missing before sunset. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was expected to be one of them. Smith had been in England for 6 weeks. In that time, he had built a reputation unlike anyone else in the squadron. The nickname came quickly: Snuffy. It came from a comic strip character, Lazy Smith from Barney Google and Snuffy Smith, a scheming hillbilly who avoided responsibility whenever possible. The name stuck. Smith resented military discipline from the beginning. He was older than most of the men around him and hated taking orders from officers who were sometimes 10 years younger. He had not even joined the Army Air Forces voluntarily. A judge in Michigan had given him a choice: pay overdue child support and face jail, or enlist in the military. Smith chose the uniform, but he never embraced the life of a soldier. At RAF Thule in England, his behavior quickly became infamous. He slept through mission briefings. He argued with officers. He lectured other airmen endlessly about politics, philosophy, and religion until they walked away in frustration. His personnel record filled with disciplinary notes. Within the 423rd Bombardment Squadron, a simple rule developed. No one wanted to fly with Snuffy Smith. Bomber crews depended on trust. 10 men shared a single aircraft, and every life depended on the others. Pilots requested replacements if Smith appeared on their crew list. When a ball turret gunner was needed, they asked for anyone else. The ball turret was one of the most terrifying positions in any aircraft of the war. A small steel and glass sphere mounted beneath the bomber's belly. The gunner curled inside it in a fetal position, surrounded by ammunition belts and 2.50 caliber machine guns. There was no armor except thin aluminum and plexiglass. 30,000 feet of open sky surrounded him on every side. But physically, Smith was ideal for the job. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, small enough to fit comfortably into the cramped turret. In every other way, the squadron considered him a liability. For 6 weeks, he remained grounded while other crews flew combat. Mission after mission left without him. Until the morning of May 1st. One bomber crew suddenly needed a replacement gunner. There were no other men available. For the first time since arriving in England, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith climbed aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress bound for combat. The aircraft's pilot was Captain Lewis Johnson. Johnson was a veteran, and this mission was supposed to be his last. He was flying his 25th combat mission, the final one required before returning home to the United States. 25 missions. That number had become legendary among bomber crews. Survive 25 flights over Europe and you went home alive. One more mission stood between Captain Johnson and safety. One more mission. Smith had no idea what he was about to experience. In training, targets didn't shoot back. He had practiced on firing ranges and memorized emergency procedures. But he had never seen a German fighter diving at him with cannons blazing. He had never watched a bomber explode in midair. He had never smelled burning gasoline at 25,000 feet. He would learn all of it that day. And the lesson would begin with a navigational mistake that placed their bomber directly over one of the most heavily defended cities in occupied France. The German fighters saw the smoke immediately. A burning bomber was an easy target. The Focke-Wulf 190 circled back for another attack run. They came in low and fast, their cannons flashing. Explosive shells tore through the thin aluminum skin of the B-17 Flying Fortress, punching new holes into a fuselage that was already shredded by flak and fire. Inside the waist section, Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith was forced into a brutal rhythm. Fire. Guns. Fire again. Every time the fighters returned, Smith had to abandon the burning wreckage behind him and swing the waist gun toward the incoming aircraft. He had never fired at a real enemy before. His training had consisted of shooting at stationary targets on a practice range. Now German fighters were diving past his window at 300 miles per hour. Smith gripped the twin .50 caliber machine guns and fired short bursts into the sky, trying to fill the air with enough bullets to force the fighters to break away. Then he turned back to the fire, then back to the guns, then back to the fire again. For nearly 90 minutes, Smith fought two battles at the same time. Behind him, flames roared through the radio compartment where aviation fuel had ignited. Around him, ammunition detonated as heat triggered the powder charges inside the .50 caliber rounds. Every few seconds, another bullet cracked loose from a cooking ammunition box and ricocheted through the fuselage like shrapnel. And outside the aircraft, German fighters kept attacking. Yet somehow the man who had spent 6 weeks being called useless was now the only thing standing between 6 surviving crewmen and certain death. In the cockpit, Captain Louis Johnson fought a different battle. The bomber was dying. Control cables had been severed by cannon fire. Hydraulic lines were damaged. Instruments flickered or failed entirely. The aircraft constantly tried to roll or dive. Johnson wrestled with the yoke, forcing the crippled bomber to remain in the air. All he needed was time. Time to reach England. Time to find a runway. Time before the burning fuselage tore itself apart. Behind him, Smith slowly began to gain control of the disaster. The flames finally started to shrink. The ammunition boxes were gone. The worst of the fire had burned itself out. The waste compartment was now a nightmare of charred metal, melted wiring, and black smoke. But the fire was dead. Smith had beaten it, and he had done it alone. He crawled toward the tail section. Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner, was still alive. Gibson had been hit during the initial fighter attack. Shrapnel had torn into his legs and torso, leaving him trapped in the narrow tail compartment while the fire raged only feet away. Smith reached him with the aircraft's emergency medical kit. Working in cramped darkness, he bandaged the wounds as best he could. He spoke calmly, reassuring the wounded gunner while the bomber continued rattling through the sky. Then Smith crawled back toward the waist guns, just in case the fighters returned. But the German pilots had already turned back. They would not risk flying out over the English Channel, where British Spitfires regularly patrolled. The crippled bomber was left alone. Smoke streamed from the aircraft as it limped toward England. Below them, the channel stretched out like cold steel. If the bomber crashed here, the crew would have perhaps 4 minutes before freezing water claimed them. Rescue was possible, but not likely. Hundreds of American airmen had already vanished beneath those gray waters during the first months of 1943. In the cockpit, Johnson studied the fuel gauges. They were almost empty. The ruptured tank had spilled most of their fuel over France. Whatever remained might barely carry them to land. If the engines held, if the wind stayed calm, if the burned fuselage didn't tear itself apart before they reached the coast. Then, through the haze ahead, land appeared. Cornwall, England. But there was no chance of reaching their home base. They needed to land immediately. Johnson spotted the nearest possible airfield, RAF Predanach, a small grass runway on the southwestern tip of England. It wasn't built for heavy bombers, but it was flat, and it was close. Their only option. Johnson lined up the approach. The landing gear extended. 3 green lights glowed on the instrument panel. Gear locked. He reduced power and guided the damaged bomber toward the field. The aircraft sank toward the runway. The wheels touched grass. For a moment, everything felt calm. The bomber rolled across the field. They had made it. Then the fuselage failed. The fire had weakened the structure far more than anyone realized. As the weight of the aircraft settled onto its landing gear, the damaged aluminum skin finally gave way. The bomber snapped in half behind the wings. The nose section slid forward across the field. The tail section stopped abruptly behind it. Emergency crews who had been waiting beside the runway ran toward the wreckage. They expected to find bodies. Instead, they saw Maynard Smith climbing out of the shattered fuselage. His hands were wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. His flight suit was black with soot and burn marks. And beside him, he was helping the wounded tail gunner down from the wreckage. Later, ground crews examined what remained of the aircraft. They counted the damage. More than 3,500 bullet and shell holes riddled the bomber. No one understood how the airplane had remained in the air long enough to reach England. By every engineering standard, it should have fallen from the sky long before reaching the channel. That evening, Captain Johnson filed his mission report. His conclusion was simple. Without Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, the bomber and everyone inside it would have died over France. Johnson recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Within days, the story began spreading across the Allied forces. And soon the man nobody in the squadron had wanted to fly with would become one of the most famous airmen in the entire war. For 6 weeks, the men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron had avoided Maynard Snuffy Smith. They complained about him constantly, about his attitude, his laziness, his inability to function as part of a crew. Now the same man was suddenly being celebrated as a national hero. Newspapers called him brave. Radio broadcasters called him extraordinary. The Army Air Forces called him the kind of soldier America needed. But the squadron understood a more complicated truth. What Smith had done on May 1st, 1943 was undeniably heroic. No one questioned that. Inside a burning B-17 flying fortress, surrounded by exploding ammunition and choking smoke, he had fought a fire for 90 minutes and saved the lives of the remaining crew. Many men would have panicked. Most would have bailed out. Smith had stayed. But heroism in one moment does not erase the personality that existed before it. And Smith remained the same difficult man the squadron had known for weeks. He still argued with officers. He still lectured other airmen about politics and philosophy long after they stopped listening. He still believed that his age and intelligence made him superior to the younger men around him. Now there was only one difference. He had a Medal of Honor recommendation backing up his sense of importance. The attention went to his head almost immediately. Smith began signing autographs with a flourish. Sergeant Maynard Smith, C.M.H. The Congressional Medal of Honor he had not even received yet. He told the story of the burning bomber again and again. Every new listener heard a slightly different version. Small details changed. The dramatic moments grew longer. His role in the chaos became larger each time he described it. The core of the story was still true. He had fought the fire. He had saved the crew. But the decorations around that truth began to drift into exaggeration. It became a strange paradox. A man who had earned genuine heroism, but who could not resist embellishing the story of that heroism. The squadron tolerated it. They had no choice. Criticizing him publicly would embarrass the entire unit. And soon he would receive the highest military decoration in the United States. The recommendation moved quickly through the chain of command. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, reviewed the case personally. The evidence was undeniable. Captain Johnson's report, witness statements from surviving crew members, and the physical condition of the bomber itself. Every document confirmed the same conclusion. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith had performed acts of courage far beyond what could reasonably be expected of any airman. Eaker approved the recommendation. The paperwork moved to Washington. The War Department reviewed the case. They agreed. The Medal of Honor was authorized. A ceremony was planned. It would be historic. For the first time in the European theater of the war, an enlisted airman would receive the Medal of Honor. The date was set for July 15, 1943. The presentation would take place at RAF Philly, headquarters of the 306th Bomb Group, and the medal would be awarded personally by Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The Army Air Forces prepared carefully. A formation of B-17 bombers would fly overhead during the ceremony. A platform was built. Photographers were invited. Newsreel cameras prepared to capture the moment for movie theaters across the United States. The story of Snuffy Smith would become part of the national narrative of the war. There was just one small problem. No one had actually told Maynard Smith the date of his own ceremony. In the confusion of planning a large military event, everyone assumed someone else had notified him. No one had. On the morning of July 15th, Secretary Stimson stood on the ceremonial platform. The bombers circled overhead. The cameras rolled. Hundreds of airmen gathered around the field. And the hero of the day was missing. Officers began searching the base. They checked the barracks, the operations buildings, the officers' club. Every location an airman might reasonably be on a summer morning. Still no Smith. Meanwhile, the bombers continued circling overhead, burning fuel the 8th Air Force could barely spare. Finally, someone checked the mess hall kitchen. That was where they found him. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was not eating breakfast. He was scraping leftover food from metal trays into garbage bins. The Medal of Honor recipient had been assigned to kitchen duty as punishment for his latest disciplinary violation. The officer who discovered him never recorded what was said, but Smith was rushed out of the kitchen and taken directly to the ceremony. He arrived wearing his work uniform, sleeves stained with grease from the kitchen. There was barely time for him to wash his hands before Secretary Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The cameras captured the moment. The photographs went out across the United States. But the official story left something out. The newspapers celebrated the hero. They did not mention that he had been washing dishes when they found him. Back at Thule, the airmen knew the truth. Within hours, the story spread across the entire 8th Air Force. The hero who almost missed his own ceremony. The Medal of Honor recipient who had been assigned to kitchen duty. Veterans would repeat the story for decades afterward, not to diminish his courage, but to prove something else. That courage and character are not always the same thing. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Each time he climbed back into the ball turret and stared down at the earth thousands of feet below. Each time he watched the sky for German fighters and waited for flak to explode around the bomber formation. But heroism does not make fear disappear. And eventually the strain caught up with him. After his 5th mission following the award, doctors noticed the symptoms. Nightmares, anxiety, difficulty concentrating. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1943, the Army called it operational exhaustion. He was grounded. No more combat flights. The man who had saved 6 lives over France would spend the rest of the war behind a desk. Smith never adjusted well to the change. Journalists still wanted interviews. Photographers still wanted pictures. But his daily life now consisted of paperwork in a quiet administrative office. The same disciplinary problems returned. Arguments with officers, missed duties, conflicts with authority. By December 1944, the Army lost patience. In an unprecedented decision, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, Medal of Honor recipient, was reduced in rank to private. The Army kept the decision quiet. Publicizing it would have damaged the heroic image they had already presented to the world. Smith was permanently grounded. His flying days were over. In February 1945, the Army sent him home. The war in Europe still had 4 months left. Bombers would continue flying over Germany. Young airmen would continue dying in the skies over Europe. But Maynard Smith would not be among them. He returned to Michigan. His hometown of Cairo organized a parade in his honor. Crowds gathered to cheer the local man who had become a national hero. And somewhere behind the speeches and applause remained the strange truth of his story. A difficult man, a reluctant soldier, and a moment of courage so extraordinary that it changed how history remembered him forever. The town of Cairo, Michigan welcomed Maynard Smith home as a hero. People lined the streets. Flags waved from storefronts and porches. Bands played patriotic songs while crowds cheered as the open car carrying the town's most famous son rolled slowly through the parade route. Many of the people watching remembered Smith from before the war. They remembered the stubborn young man who argued with everyone and struggled to hold a steady job. But that was not the man they were celebrating. The newspapers had told them a different story. A local boy had become a Medal of Honor hero. And for one afternoon, that was the only story that mattered. Smith stood in the back of the car and waved to the cheering crowd. For that brief moment, he was exactly what the Army Air Forces wanted him to be. A symbol, an inspiration, proof that ordinary Americans could become heroes when the moment demanded it. The parade ended. The crowds went home. And Maynard Smith was left with the question that confronted millions of veterans after the war. What comes next? Germany surrendered in May 1945. The bombing campaign that had devastated occupied Europe finally ended. The statistics were staggering. The 8th Air Force had dropped more than 600,000 tons of bombs during the war. Over 26,000 American airmen had been killed. Another 28,000 were captured or listed as missing. It had been the most costly air campaign in military history. Maynard Smith had contributed 90 minutes to that campaign. One mission, one burning bomber, one afternoon of extraordinary courage. His discharge papers arrived on May 26, 1945. He was 34 years old, a former private with the Medal of Honor, and no clear idea how to live the rest of his life. The transition to civilian life proved difficult. Smith had struggled to hold steady work before the war. His personality had not changed. He remained argumentative, opinionated, and convinced that his intelligence entitled him to special treatment. Employers discovered quickly that hiring a war hero did not necessarily mean hiring an easy employee. Jobs came and went. Tax preparation work, clerical positions, temporary office work. Each followed the same pattern. Smith argued with supervisors, clashed with coworkers, and eventually either quit or was dismissed. The Medal of Honor opened doors. His behavior closed them again. His personal life followed a similar path. Smith remarried after the war. That marriage failed. A third marriage followed. It failed as well. The pattern repeated itself. The heroic story attracted attention. The complicated man behind the story often drove people away. By the early 1950s, Maynard Smith had returned to the same uncertain life he had lived before the war. The Medal of Honor rested quietly in a drawer. Newspaper clippings slowly yellowed with age. The fame that once made him a national symbol faded into the ordinary struggles of American life. He was not alone. Thousands of veterans returned home carrying decorations, memories, and wounds that few civilians understood. Heroism did not pay the mortgage. Combat experience did not translate easily into civilian careers. The psychological toll of war remained poorly understood. Men who had survived bombing missions or ground combat often struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the inability to reconnect with normal life. Today, we recognize these symptoms as post-traumatic stress. In the 1940s, veterans were simply expected to adjust. Many could not. Smith coped the only way he knew how. He told his story, over and over again. The story of May 1st, 1943 became the central event of his life. At veterans' gatherings, in interviews, in casual conversations with strangers, he repeated the tale of the burning bomber. And as the years passed, the story grew. Details expanded. Moments became more dramatic. By the 1970s, some versions of the story included actions Smith could not possibly have performed. In one retelling, he even described flying the damaged bomber back to England himself. In reality, that had been done by another airman on another mission. Veterans who knew the truth rarely corrected him publicly. The code of military brotherhood protected even difficult men. Smith was one of them. Whatever his flaws, he still wore the Medal of Honor. Historians later struggled with the contradictions. The documented record of May 1st, 1943 was already remarkable. Smith had fought a raging fire inside a bomber for 90 minutes. He had thrown burning ammunition boxes out of the aircraft with his bare hands. He had saved the lives of 6 crewmen. The facts alone were extraordinary. They required no embellishment. But Smith continued adding to the story, perhaps because that single afternoon had been the defining moment of his life. Everything before it had been failure. Everything after it had been struggle. For 90 minutes over Brest, France, Maynard Smith had been exactly what history demanded. A hero. The years passed. Veterans of the 306th Bomb Group held reunions and shared memories. Some men had built successful lives after the war. Others struggled quietly. All carried experiences that could never be fully explained to anyone who had not lived through them. Smith attended some of the reunions. He was tolerated more than embraced. The men remembered everything. They remembered the arguments, the disciplinary problems, the kitchen duty on the morning of his Medal of Honor ceremony. And they remembered May 1st. Both memories existed side by side. In 1979, Smith gave one final major interview. A military magazine called Sergeants published his account of the mission, By then the story had reached its most elaborate form. But no one challenged him. He was 68 years old. Whatever distortions had appeared over the years, the central truth remained. Once, in the middle of war, Maynard Smith had performed an act of courage so extraordinary that it earned the highest decoration his country could give. And that would have to be enough. The Medal of Honor has been awarded roughly 3,500 times in American history. Each one represents a moment when an individual risked everything beyond what duty required. Smith met that standard on May 1st, 1943. One man, one burning bomber, fire, exploding ammunition, enemy fighters outside the aircraft, and the knowledge that escape was possible. But he chose to stay. He chose to fight the fire. And because he stayed, 6 other men lived. History often remembers heroes as perfect figures. But the truth is more complicated. Maynard Snuffy Smith was difficult. He was argumentative. He made mistakes. But on one afternoon in the skies over France, he did something extraordinary. And sometimes that single moment is enough to secure a place in history. In war, survival often determines whose heroism is remembered. This truth does not diminish what Maynard Smith accomplished. The Medal of Honor is not given lightly. It is earned through actions that rise far beyond duty. But aerial combat in 1943 carried a brutal reality. Heroism was everywhere, and recognition was rare. The men who climbed into B-17 bombers understood the odds. Each mission over German-occupied Europe carried a real possibility of death. Crews did not expect medals or parades. They expected only to do their job and, if fortune allowed it, to return home alive. Maynard Smith did return. After the war, he lived more than 4 decades. In his later years, he moved to Florida, settling near Tampa Bay, where the warm climate eased the aches of an aging body. The Medal of Honor occasionally opened doors. He attended ceremonies, spoke at veterans' events, and met younger generations eager to hear the story of the burning bomber. Yet for the rest of his life, he remained defined by 90 minutes in the sky over Brest, France. 90 minutes that had occurred when he was just 31 years old. As the years passed, his health slowly declined. The hands that had once thrown burning ammunition boxes out of a bomber developed arthritis. The lungs that had inhaled smoke and fuel fumes grew weaker. The body that had once endured unimaginable strain gradually became that of an ordinary elderly man. On May 11, 1984, Maynard Harrison Smith died in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. Heart failure was listed as the cause. He had outlived many of the men who flew with him, and even some who once refused to fly with him. The Army honored his passing despite the complicated record that followed his moment of heroism. Medal of Honor recipients are entitled to burial at Arlington National Cemetery, regardless of what happened afterward. His demotion did not matter. His disciplinary record did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the blue ribbon with white stars and the gold medal suspended from it. Maynard Smith was buried among the rows of white headstones that mark the resting place of American soldiers. Generals lie beside privates there. Heroes lie beside ordinary men. In death, rank and reputation fade into the same quiet equality. His grave marker is simple. Name, rank, dates, Medal of Honor. The stone does not mention kitchen duty, disciplinary problems, failed jobs, or complicated years after the war. It records only the essential truth. This man served. This man was honored. This man rests here. And that raises the final question. How should he be remembered? History often prefers simple stories. It wants heroes to be heroic in every aspect of life. It wants courage in combat to reflect perfect character. But Maynard Smith did not fit that narrative. He was difficult before the war. He remained difficult during the war. And he was still difficult afterward. For 90 minutes, he was heroic. For 72 years, he was complicated. He earned the nation's highest honor, and often the nation's frustration as well. Perhaps that complexity is the most honest legacy he could leave. The 306th Bomb Group, the unit Smith served with, flew 342 combat missions before the war ended. They dropped more than 22,000 tons of bombs across occupied Europe. 171 of their aircraft were lost. Behind each loss was a crew. Behind each crew was a family who eventually received a telegram beginning with words no parent or wife ever wanted to read. The men of the 306th became one of the most experienced bomber groups in the 8th Air Force. They flew some of the earliest and most dangerous missions, when long-range fighter escort was limited and losses were catastrophic. They adapted, they endured, and they continued flying until there was nothing left to bomb. Maynard Smith's story became only one chapter in that larger history. The 306th Bomb Group Association preserved records of every mission and every crew that flew from the runways of RAF Philly in England. In those records, Smith appears exactly as he was, a difficult man who performed an extraordinary act. Today, visitors can learn about that history at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force near Savannah, Georgia. Inside the museum stands a restored B-17 bomber. Visitors can walk through its narrow interior. They can see how cramped the waist gun positions were. They can see the ball turret hanging beneath the aircraft like a steel and glass sphere. Guides explain how a gunner would curl into the turret in a fetal position, rotating with the guns as he tracked enemy fighters through the sight. They describe the isolation of that position and the complete dependence on the crew above if electrical power failed. Over Brest, Smith's turret lost power. He cranked it open manually. Then he climbed into a burning aircraft. That single detail captures the brutal reality of aerial combat in 1943. Technology failed constantly. Survival depended on human improvisation. The men who lived were often the ones who refused to accept that a situation was hopeless. The airfield at RAF Philly still exists today. The buildings where young Americans once lived and worked have mostly disappeared, but the land remembers. Markers identify the site as a former American bomber base. Visitors from the United States still come there occasionally, sons and grandsons standing where their fathers once stood before flying toward Germany. Eastern England absorbed enormous sacrifices during the war. Thousands of young Americans took off from those quiet fields, crossed the Channel, and disappeared into the sky. Many never returned. The ones who did carried memories that stayed with them forever. Maynard Smith's Medal of Honor remains part of that history. The official citation describes his actions in calm bureaucratic language, fighting fires, administering first aid, manning guns, throwing burning ammunition overboard. But no citation can truly capture what it meant to stand inside a burning aircraft while enemy fighters attacked, and 3 crewmen had already jumped into the sky. It can only record that those things happened. The man himself defies easy categorization. He was not a natural hero. He was not even considered a good soldier. But when the moment arrived that demanded everything a human being could give, Maynard Smith gave it. For 90 minutes over France, he revealed a courage that surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. And that may be the real lesson of his story. Heroism does not require perfection. It does not require popularity. It requires only one thing: the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of fear, regardless of odds, regardless of who you were before or who you may become afterward. Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith was a flawed man who did one perfect thing. And sometimes, that is enough for history.